Here in session 94, we're going to be looking at the discriminant. And if you remember from previous sessions, when we graphed the quadratic functions, we saw that we had three different scenarios, or three main scenarios that occurred. If we take a look at our green graph here, we see that the graph of this curve, it's called a parabola. The parabola is a special type of curve, and every graph of a quadratic equation or quadratic function has as its graph a parabola. We can see here that this green graph of this will go on and extend on indefinitely upwards, but the graph at its lowest point is right here. The graph of this particular function never intersects the x-axis. Our second example here of the red parabola intersects the x-axis just once. And then in our third example here, our blue parabola intersects the x-axis in two different points. So we illustrated that all quadratic equations either have two solutions, and remember the solution being the place on the x-axis at which that parabola intersects or crosses. A quadratic equation can either have two solutions, as this blue parabola shows, or it can have just one solution, as this red parabola shows, or it could have zero solutions, as this green parabola shows. Now, if we take a look once again at our quadratic formula states that for every quadratic equation, x is going to be equal to minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, let's go ahead and focus our attention at this point on just one portion of this formula, and the portion that we're going to look at is the portion or the part that is within the radical sign, the b squared minus 4ac portion. What happens if b squared minus 4ac is a positive number? Let's just choose one. Let's say it's a 10. We now have the square root of 10. If we now go ahead and take a look at our equation, our quadratic formula, we have minus 6 plus or minus 10 over 2a. And just for argument's sake, let's say that the bottom 2a is equal to 4. So if our portion of our equation that's inside this square root is a 10 and our bottom is 4, let's see how many different answers we're going to get with this positive answer inside this. We have minus 6 plus 10, that would be 16, or excuse me, minus 6 plus 10 would be 4, over 4, that would be 1, 4 over 4 is 1, or we could go minus 6 minus 10, which would be minus 16 over 4, or that would give us a minus 4. We can see here that gives us two answers. If our value of b squared minus 4ac is anything else that's positive, let's say it's 100. And once again, our bottom part here is 4. We have minus 6 plus 100 over 4, and then minus 6 minus 100 over 4. Well, you can see we're going to get two different answers. One is going to be the minus 6 plus the 100 divided by 4, and then the second answer is going to be the minus 6 minus the 100 over 4. So irregardless of what our value is here, as long as b squared minus 4ac is some type of positive value, we are then going to get two different answers for x. One answer is going to be calculated by going plus this 17, which is our value of b squared minus 4ac. The other value for x is going to be taken by this minus b minus the square root of 17. So that's one way of showing one of the situations that we have going on in our previous illustration. Anytime your b squared minus 4ac is positive, the square root of that positive number is going to be another positive number of some sort. And then that number is either going to be added to the minus b or it's going to be subtracted from the minus b. And whether it's added or subtracted is going to give us two different answers. So if we pop back here to our first screen and we take a look at our blue parabola here, we can see that our blue parabola intersects our x-axis twice. And if we come back here, it intersects the x-axis whenever this b squared minus 4ac is positive. That intersects the x-axis twice. Well, let's say that our b squared minus 4ac equals 0. I'm going to put a 0 there. Well, the square root of 0 is 0. So if we go minus b plus 0 divided by 2a, is that any different than going minus b minus 0 over 2a? No, we're going to get the same answer both times. Because our original value, minus b, is not going to change. Whether we add a 0 or subtract a 0 from it, our minus b is going to remain a minus b. So if we come back here, we can see that our red parabola intersects the x-axis just once. So over here, we have our discriminant here is going to be b squared minus 4ac equaling 0. And since we have a 0 here, we're going to be left with a minus b over 2a, which means we're going to have just one solution. We're not going to be adding or subtracting anything to this minus b because this is a 0, and b minus b plus 0 is minus b minus 0 is minus b. So in both of those situations, this 0 is only going to leave us then with one unique value for x. So whenever this b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, that means we're just going to have one solution to our quadratic equation. Well, what happens if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0? Let's say it equals minus 11. Well, what's the square root of negative 11? There aren't any. At this point, there are no square roots to negative numbers because, remember, the square root of something is a particular number multiplied by itself that'll give you this other number. Well, what number times itself equals a negative number? There aren't any. A positive times a positive gives you a positive answer. A negative times a negative gives you a positive answer. So whenever this b squared minus 4ac turns out to be negative, there's no way you can add the square root of a negative number to our minus b or subtract it from our minus b. So in that situation there where our is negative, where the b squared minus 4ac is negative, that means that we're going to have 0 solutions to the problem. So let's once again come back to our first screen. Our green parabola here never intersects the x-axis. So how many solutions to the equation of this function do we have? We have 0 because it never intersects the x-axis. So if this green parabola never intersects the x-axis, what do we know about b squared minus 4ac for that particular graph or that particular equation or function? We know that b squared minus 4ac is going to be negative. That's why it never intersects the x-axis, because we don't have square roots of negative numbers. Let's come back here to our red parabola. It intersects our graph and the x-axis at just one point. What do we know about our b squared minus 4ac then? If the graph intersects at just one point, what do we know about b squared minus 4ac? Well, it has to equal 0. And then for our blue parabola, it intersects twice. So what do we know about the b squared minus the 4ac for that particular equation? It's going to be positive. And since it's positive, it's going to have 2 solutions. There's a special name that's given to this b squared minus 4ac. It's called the discriminant. And that will be outlined for you on our review page. Whenever the discriminant is positive, the equation is going to have 2 solutions. Whenever the discriminant is 0, that quadratic equation will have just one solution. And whenever the discriminant is negative, that quadratic equation will have 0 solutions. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple examples here. 2x squared minus 7x plus 2. What we want to do here is we don't want to determine what the answers are by using the quadratic formula. And I'm just going to draw that line to separate here. The question here is determine the discriminant and determine how many solutions this problem has. We don't care at this point what the solutions are, just tell us how many. Are there 0, 1, or 2 solutions, and what's the discriminant? Well, in this equation here, a is 2, b is negative 7, and c is 2. Our discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So b is minus 7, so we're going to take minus 7 squared, and we're going to subtract 4 times a, well, our a is 2, times c, and c is 2. Minus 7 squared is 49. And what we're going to do is subtract from that our 4 times 2 times 2. Well, 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 49 minus 16 is 33. Our discriminant has a value of 33. That's positive. So how many answers does this quadratic equation have? It has 2. Since our discriminant is positive, we have 2 solutions. And once again, the discriminant would be minus 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times 2. Let's do one more and then we'll finish up here. 6x squared plus x plus 1 equals 0. And I really probably should have put a plus or equal to 0 up there as well. The question is determine what the discriminant is and then tell us how many solutions there are. Well, the discriminant once again is b squared minus 4ac. b is 1. So there's 1 squared minus 4 times a. A is 6. There's our 6 for a. And c is 1. So our discriminant here is 1 squared minus 4 times 6 times 1. Well, 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times 6 is minus 24, minus 24 times 1 is minus 24. 1 minus 24 is negative 23. So our discriminant has a value of negative 23. That should then tell us how many solutions we have. How many solutions do we have? We have 0, because when your discriminant is negative, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. As a review then, the discriminant is the expression that is inside the radical sign in the quadratic formula. Next, the discriminant in the quadratic formula is represented by b squared minus 4ac. Next, if the discriminant is positive, that means that the quadratic equation will have 2 solutions. If the discriminant is 0, the quadratic equation will have 1 solution. And if the discriminant is negative, the quadratic equation will have 0 solutions. That wraps up session 94 on the discriminant.